discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. This is the second in our series Cinema Slackers, where we take a psychedelic trip through some of cinema's greatest wanderers and drifters. Kick back, roll one up, and listen in.
I just had the weirdest dream. Back on the bus there? Do you ever have those dreams that are just completely real? I mean, they're so vivid, it's just like completely real. It's like, there's always something bizarre going on in those. I have one about every 2 years or something. I always remember them really good. It's like there's always someone getting run over, something really weird. One time I had lunch with Tolstoy. Another time I was a roadie for Frank Zappa. Anyway, so this dream I just had, it was just like that, except instead of anything bizarre going on, I mean, there was nothing going on at all. Man, it was like the Omega Man. There was just nobody around. I was just traveling around, staring out the windows of buses and trains and cars, When I was at home, I was like flipping through the TV stations endlessly, reading. I mean, how many dreams do you have where you read in a dream, Wait. Man, there was this book I just read on the well, it was my dream, so I guess I wrote it or something. But, man, it was bizarre. It was like, the premise for this whole book was that every thought you have creates its own reality. It's like every choice or decision you make, the thing you choose not to do fractions off and becomes its own reality, and just goes on from there forever. I mean, it's like, in The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy meets the Scarecrow and they do that little dance at that crossroads and they think about going all those directions, then they end up going in that one direction. I mean, all those other directions, just because they thought about it, became separate realities. I mean, they just went on from there and lived the rest of their life, entirely different movies, but we'll never see it because, we're kind of trapped in this one reality restriction type of thing,
Today we'll be discussing Richard Linklater's 1990 film Slacker, which follows the day in the life of a bunch of young people in Austin, Texas, as they meander and have poetic and philosophical discussions about the meaning of life and Madonna's pap smear.
That's a pretty good summary right there. How else can you sum this movie up?
Yeah.
So this film is very stream of consciousness, almost. It's very meandering, which makes sense for the type of people that he's focusing on in this film. Mm-hmm. It goes kind of from one place to another, one character to another. We never linger in one place or with one character for very long, probably not more than a few minutes. Mm-hmm. And the film begins with Linklater himself getting into the back of a taxi cab, which seems fitting. He arrives in town on a bus, and the first conversation is about dreams, going different directions in your life. It's a great way to open the rest of the film up. He's basically telling you what you're about to experience for the next hour and a half. The whole film is very dreamlike and veers off in, like we said, whatever direction it pleases.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting exercise, I think, because it kind of takes every rule that you would normally associate with good storytelling in cinema and kind of throws it out the window.
For sure.
I think one thing that's particularly interesting is that we don't really follow a main character in any capacity. It just jumps around, but I wouldn't even really call it an ensemble piece because it's not even about a core of characters.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact number, but it has to follow probably the stories of at least 30 people, if not more.
It's all in one town, though, Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And Linklater himself is from Houston, Texas, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. But he did, so Richard Linklater did start the Austin Film Society, which is now pretty reputable.
Right.
That was one thing I was wondering. We'll jump around a little bit, but I was wondering how he was able to recruit this many people on a low budget film. I believe the budget on this was between $20,000 and $25,000 at the time, something around there. Which neither Mark nor I were able to figure out how he raised this money. Yeah, but once again, that's it's not an absurd amount of money. It's not like he put $700,000 or $800,000 on a self-funded film. So it's very possible that he just saved up for a while and was able to do this on his own.
And, he didn't go to film school, so maybe he did save some money there.
Yeah. But it seems like he was able to kind of round up a really talented group of people to be on screen for this, and I'm not sure. I would venture to guess that most of them are not actors and actresses.
Yeah.
But they all seem to be very specific in their own roles. They all seem to be very believable. Like some of the performances in this are incredibly strong, which is kind of surprising. I think, to me, because a lot of the time you see lower budget films, particularly the non-actors, and the one thing that won't hold up, you'll have a good young director, a good young DP, good writing, but what will sometimes get kind of wonky is the performances. But
Hmm.
I think in this, it really kind of holds, the performances are almost the glue that hold the whole
Hmm.
film together. And much of that probably comes from the fact that these people are talking about things that they actually
Hmm.
would be talking about. I wouldn't doubt that some of these scenes were literally conversations that Richard Linklater
Yeah.
maybe had with a friend and then cast that friend to
Hmm.
just regurgitate the conversation or probably improvise over it.
Although it's funny though, because in a way, I mean, would you say this is how people actually speak? I would say it's a little it's that I would say it's not that way, but it doesn't really matter, like in a way, because
Yeah.
like you said, they're talking about things that you would just talk about with a friend on a Saturday night when you're over some beers or something. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's how the dialogue is, and though it is, to me it seems very like scripted. Like another movie we're about to talk about after this, Clerks, is similar in that way, where they're it's almost like these movies are perceived to have very realistic dialogue, but when you watch them again, you kind of question that a little bit. But it's more what they're talking about. It's
Mm.
more the way the characters are and the situations that they're in that comes off as very relatable.
Yeah.
And you mentioned all the characters in this film. Obviously, too many to mention here, and no main character. But this is one of those films where I feel like the camera itself is a character,
Mhm.
maybe even the most important character. It's always drifting, floating, just like the other characters. And the film is not all one shot, but it feels like it is. And I
That
found
that was
that
something I was
very
going to bring up
interesting.
as well. It never actually feels like there's a cut in this
Hmm.
movie. Like there are plenty, I mean there are a lot of long takes as well. There are some takes that just go on and on and
Hmm.
on, and which is, honestly really really impressive for not a first time filmmaker, but someone with really limited resources. This was shot, I'm not sure if this was shot on 35 millimeter or 16. My would guess probably 16,
Let me look
but I
at
could
that.
be wrong about that.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll take a look at that while you're speaking.
but it's really so, like, the technical aspects of this film are really impressive for the resources that they had available. But the camera, as Mark mentioned, the camera's just kind of floating around
Hmm.
and moving in a really dynamic, complicated, interesting way. Um,
Oh, okay. So it was 16 millimeter
mhm.
that they shot it on. There was a version that showed in 35.
Yeah, it probably got
Slight,
blown up at a certain point
slightly
and
modified. Yeah,
cleaned
that
up.
for the nationwide distribution, obviously. But
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
And that's, something that I think was common at the time. You'd see a lot of movies. I think that Slacker was kind of predated a lot of the '90s independent cinema movement, which we'll once again talk about more
Hmm.
when we get to Clerks, because that was kind of more at the heyday.
Hmm.
Slackers was kind of the film that started the whole thing,
Yeah.
in a way. In a way, because
Well, it
weirdly I
started a
saw,
certain kind of indie film for sure.
yeah, a certain kind of American, philosophical, meandering,
Hmm.
independent cinema that you would see a lot of throughout the rest of the decade.
Because
And
there was,
interestingly,
yeah. Sorry, I was gonna say there was Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which was like the first one that people really took notice of in this way,
mhm,
but it was a completely different kind of film. So
yeah, totally different. This was more about, the everyday, the quotidian kind
yeah.
of uh,
Yeah.
conversations that people were having with each other. It wasn't
Hmm.
about drama, because there really is. I mean, there are a few moments of drama in this film.
Yeah.
There's one scene where someone pulls a gun out, but it gets resolved with
That
in
was
like a 4 or 5 second long conversation.
that was something I wanted to talk about because speaking about the camera and how that is kind of just floating around, we go in and out of people's lives and we only get glimpses. It's funny because in the film, something as serious and eventful as a hit and run is treated with like the same weight as a casual conversation or someone
Hmm.
walking into a cafe. Like it all has that same floaty feel to it.
Yeah,
And like for the hit and run, we only see the aftermath of it really. And so I thought that was interesting that everything's even keel and almost on the same level the whole film.
yeah,
Did you feel
and
like
if you,
that when you watched it as well?
yeah, and I feel like, in a certain way it made the film feel really long.
Hmm. Yeah,
Which, but I don't want that to come across as a criticism.
dreamlike. It
I
was
don't think it was
dreamlike.
bad. Yeah, it was like you could kind of just get lost in it, and it
Yeah.
just felt like it. Your brain had to kind of reset every time you would pick up with new characters, because you'd have to figure out who they were
Hmm.
about. What they were going to talk about, what their situation was. And I do think, though, that Linklater did an unbelievable job introducing characters efficiently here,
Hmm.
which I think you have to when there's this many characters, because you see a lot of films where it takes a half hour to really even understand who
Hmm.
a character is, and I don't think the camera stayed with any
You don't have that time
situation
here,
for more
yeah.
than 5 or 10 minutes
Hmm.
throughout this entire film, and you totally got these little vignettes of these people's lives, and you really connected with it. I actually saw a movie recently. It's a Chantal Ackerman film, and I'm gonna totally butcher the pronunciation. It's like Histoire d'Amérique, basically like Histories of America, food, family, and philosophy.
Hmm.
And it was this film I just happened to. So I live in New York City, and I am a member at MoMA, which for any of our New York City listeners out there, MoMA, if you haven't gone there to see movies, it's probably my favorite place to see movies in the whole city.
Hmm.
But I just happened to notice that this film was playing one day, and I went and saw it. And it has a similar vibe where it basically chronicles a couple generations of Jewish immigrants, mostly set in, I believe, Williamsburg in the late 80s. The film came out in 1989. And it kind of has a similar thing where it doesn't really focus on any one person. It's just kind of meandering around, and you're getting these little vignettes. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to have heard that Richard Linklater saw that movie
Hmm.
and came up against it at some point.
Hmm.
But it had the same kind of thing where, because you were seeing so many different characters, this movie is only about an hour and 40 minutes, as is the Chantal Ackerman film, and I think that like that length, that feeling of length, really lets you get lost in it,
Hmm.
and it's not the kind of movie that you can watch passively. Neither of them.
Hmm.
I think Slackers is the kind of not Slackers. Slacker is the kind of movie that you really have to let yourself tune into,
Hmm.
which is kind of ironic because it's called Slacker, so you would think it's the kind of thing that you could watch very casually and passively, but it is really a film that demands your attention, because
Hmm.
some of what they're talking about is really pretty deep and interesting, and obviously there are some conversations that come up that aren't as significant, but I think that pretty closely mirrors the nature of life and conversation in a way
Yeah.
that a lot of movies that claim to mirror life and conversation miss,
Hmm.
because they're able to dive into things that are really deep and significant, because we have those moments when we want to talk about the meaning of life, and we want to talk about individuality versus the collective, or conspiracy theories, but we also have moments where we just want to have a drink and talk to our friends about a band.
Yeah,
you know
I found that some of the most interesting, for me anyway, the most
Mhm.
interesting conversations were just like about relationships or really intimate things like that, which there wasn't too much of. Is mostly what you were talking about, were a lot of political, philosophical conversations, which were very interesting in their own way. But for some reason, I really I kind of, my attention was always piqued when it was like the more intimate details of the characters, because, and I think part of that is because we only do see so little of each character, and so you kind of want to know everything you can about them in that short
Mhm.
amount of time. Like, we're going to go to someone else in a few minutes, so so that was interesting, and I think you touched on this a lot, Jeremy. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this film is this kind of duality that I noticed. So to explain that a little bit, this film requires a lot of patience because, as we talked about, the pacing is very leisurely and kind of meandering. Obviously, not kind of meandering; it is very meandering.
Very meandering. Yeah.
But at the same time, it may be the perfect movie for this generation. And I don't want to sound glib here or like I'm judging. I am part of this generation in a certain way. So what I mean by that is it's perfect for this generation because it's almost made for people with shorter attention spans
Yeah.
at the same time. So
When you say this generation, you're referring to
well,
like
I guess,
millennials,
well,
the
yeah,
current.
younger, the current generation, where we are with technology right now. I mean, it's just a fact right now. I don't think people's attention spans are as long as they used to be. I could be wrong. It's just, yeah, and whether people are want to be that way or not, I think it's just the nature of how we live now. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, the film is kind of both. It's leisurely. It requires a lot of patience from the viewer, but at the same time, it is constantly going to something new, a new character, a new situation. So it's kind of it's that duality, I think, that makes it interesting in a way. And but still, the fact that there's a lack of a clear singular narrative means that the film is fairly experimental and may not be for everyone. Which is why it's a cult movie, I guess. But
Mhm.
yeah, definitely not for everyone. But at the same time, I found that interesting that the way it correlates with, because we always try to bring the movies we talk about, no matter when they're made, we try to bring it back to where we are in the here and now, 2019 now, and that's just something I was thinking about. But what do you feel about that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it's totally relevant, and I think even some of the discussion. I think the form is relevant. Like you mentioned, kind of this short attention span cinema. I think that if this film were made today, it could be released as is, or it could also be something where you just basically get a bunch of short YouTube clips.
Mm-hmm.
I almost wonder if Richard Linklater, had he come up now in today's world, if he would maybe be a vlogger and not a film director. Um,
Yeah, yeah. It's such a different world than it was. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
because it's one of those things where at least the things he seemed to be interested in at the time he was making this film. Obviously, he made Dazed and Confused. He made School of Rock. He's made some films that are a little more Hollywood. Everybody wants them, but a lot of the stuff he's dealt with is also just how do real human beings interact in a way that is sometimes cynical but sometimes sentimental. And I think if you look at someone like a Casey Neistat or someone like that who is really kind of exploring the same thing, or you look at the Before trilogy, that easily could have just been a couple vlogging, as they talk about their experiences with each other. It could happen in real time. So I almost wonder if it's something that had Richard Linklater been, 25, 30 years old today, if maybe it would have taken a different direction. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously there's no way to know. This was, interestingly, so Slacker a lot of the time gets credited as Linklater's first film. This was actually his second feature film.
Mm-hmm.
He made a Super 8 millimeter film called It's Impossible to Learn to Plow by Reading Books,
Mm-hmm.
which is available, apparently, I haven't seen it myself, available as a special feature on the Criterion Collection edition of Slacker.
Mm-hmm.
So I would really like to see that, but it is interesting. I think we do see some of the assured, confident filmmaking, probably because he has that experience.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the time you'll see first features, particularly low budget ones, even from great directors, that kind of don't have the finished feel that this movie has. Obviously, this movie, Slacker isn't perfect. There are still, I've definitely saw a boom mic in there somewhere. It's not perfect,
Mm-hmm.
but for a movie made for the budget, it's just, in my mind, kind
Mm-hmm.
of so impressive
Yeah.
how polished it is. But what I did think is interesting is some of the discussions, as we relate it to today's world, is some of the discussions even seem really, really relevant. There was a lot of stuff about Kennedy and 1950s and 60s conspiracy theories that obviously today are maybe not as relevant. But there were also discussions about global warming.
Mm-hmm.
There are discussions about, there's the one scene where there's a young man who has his life filled with televisions. He has this room where it's just
Yeah.
ceiling to floor televisions, and he says that he hasn't turned them off in 4 years, which obviously today is kind of how, I mean, I don't know the last time I just actually shut my laptop down. You put it to
Mm-hmm.
sleep, but
And
actually
just
to
had
totally shut it
silence.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, when was the last time you shut your phone off, shut your laptop off,
Mm-hmm.
completely cut out the outside world and just existed?
Yeah.
That's an interesting.
Yeah, and thinking about today's sensibilities, it's interesting. Like, when you were talking about that, you were saying he might be a vlogger or do YouTube videos, like shorter videos, and maybe they'd be all connected in some way. But you would lose the form. I think the form of a feature film is so important to this movie, and I don't think it could be. I don't think the same feeling could be recreated in a different
Yeah.
way. Because I think, do you know what I mean? Like it's
Oh, totally. Yeah.
it's the fact that it is an hour and a half that you're spending just floating around this town. That's something you couldn't get on YouTube or something, unless it was an hour and a
Yeah.
half video.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing to think about, and something that maybe has just changed. Again, attention spans are different now. So let's go back. Let's go into just talking about specifics about the making of the film and who was behind it. We've brought up Richard Linklater a lot. This was, as Jeremy said, not his first film, but it was his first breakthrough film. And it was at the start of the indie Sundance boom of the early to mid 90s. It's a pretty unanimously praised movie, one that won its share of awards and accolades at the time when it came out. And for a second feature, I agree. I've not seen his first film yet. My brother has, and I asked him about it because when I was watching Slackers again, and he said there's a lot of like long shots of landscapes and things like that. So he said it does correlate to what he eventually went on to do with Slacker. So that's interesting, and I think I will check that out. But Yeah, the average movie. I was looking at some trivia about the film, and the average movie has apparently 500 to 1,000 cuts in it. This movie only has 163, and almost a third of them come in that last segment where they're passing around the Super 8 camera. So I think
Wow.
and I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm assuming he did that intentionally, Richard Linklater, because that adds to the dreamy feel and the fact that you feel like it's all one shot when you're watching it. Um, so yeah,
That's really, those numbers are really, I didn't even realize the numbers were that
I
small.
have not confirmed these numbers, but
Yeah.
that's just what I saw when I was
But
looking
it
up
sounds
information.
believable. I mean,
Yeah.
even the fact that it sounds believable is a
Mhm.
testament to,
That sounds right. Yeah, when you're watching it, you're
it
like,
sounds
okay,
right,
yeah,
you know.
uh huh,
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah,
yeah,
no, it really is an experience. If you haven't, I mean, if you haven't seen it, I don't think we can spoil this movie,
mhm,
because it's not a plot driven movie at all. I could literally tell you scene by scene what happens, and it would
mm.
not
It's
change your experience.
about the experience.
It might even open it up so you could dig
Understand
in
it.
and
Yeah.
really, yeah.
Hmm.
But yeah, but if you haven't seen this movie, it's just really an interesting trip. It's just it's kind of almost like an anti movie in
Hmm.
terms of the writing.
Hmm.
You know, it's just so bizarre.
No core narrative, no core,
No,
no
I
main
mean
character.
it literally opens with 5 minutes of someone talking about a dream that never comes back. You know, like it's not even like they're talking about a situation that will develop in the film. It's a dream, and it's not a significant dream. I mean, in a way, it's significant because it kind of, he's talking about a dream that it's just a very average dream. You know, nothing really happens,
Hmm.
and he's saying maybe it's some other reality, and it's that kind of, which kind of almost, like you mentioned, Mark, describes what the film will go on to be.
Hmm.
It's like this other reality where it's kind of like a dream, but instead of it being a wild dream where weird things are happening, it's just, nothing really happens. There are some very dark moments, though.
Hmm.
If we say nothing happens, but at the same time, there's some pretty, like you mentioned, there's a hit and run, where someone, I believe, dies, right? The woman dies.
Yeah. Well, we never find out, but
We never find out.
it seems like she is
It
dead.
seems like she dies.
Hmm.
There are people talking about wanting to, you know, have anarchy ensue, and I think one guy says, like, remember, like, terrorism. I don't know
Hmm.
the exact quote, but terrorism is the voice of the people. There are some pretty dark people with radical ideas in this,
Hmm.
but ultimately, I think the thing that's interesting is that they're not going to do anything.
Hmm.
Like knowing who these people are, even from these brief encounters, 99% of these people will never take initiative and act on any of their ideas.
Yeah.
It's more just that they have them, which I think is a big thing that this early 90s culture explored. It was kind of the post Reagan 80s,
Hmm.
where everything was material, greed is good,
Yeah.
and then you have all of these people after that when everything had collapsed, the economy had struggled, they were still in the Bush years, we were just starting to see you know some early, like, some terrorism going on. Like, the world was in a very strange place,
Yeah.
a very transitional period. Computers were first coming into people's lives in a big way, where people weren't really sure what to do with themselves, and in a world that is preaching big money and greed and excess, and then finding out that that's wrong,
Hmm.
or wrong or problematic, it leaves the people who weren't into that to begin with in a very weird place, where they can kind of be held up in a way where it's like, well, look, these are the people who never bought into it. But then you look at those people, and they still don't have jobs, they still don't have any money. They're just hardly getting by, just talking about philosophy.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like, well, where do these people who in some way are the ideal, because they rejected the thing that everyone else was saying was so great, but then we all found out was a ticking time bomb,
Hmm.
but at the same time, they're not really contributing at anything. They're kind of just living for themselves and their ideas. So
Hmm.
where does someone like that fit in?
Yeah, and Slacker was seen as a pretty accurate portrayal of Generation X and stuff like that. So, I think that it's unavoidable. I mean, Linklater has gone on to say in interviews and whatnot that he's strayed away from being a spokesperson, for that generation, which I
Mm-hmm.
totally understand. I mean, he was just making a film, and whatever statements he was making, he wasn't. I'm sure he wasn't trying to generalize about an entire
Yeah.
generation. But when you watch Slacker, you can't deny that it's because what else can you do? That's when it was filmed. It was filmed in 1989. So right when everything you're discussing, Jeremy, is going on, and so it's almost like as everything was on the brink, is when he started filming it,
Yeah.
and we see these characters kind of trying to navigate through that malaise. Actually, the malaise of the film, it reminded me a lot of Ghost World, actually, for some reason. A little less comedic, obviously, but and Ghost World's more of a dark comedy. But I don't know if you've seen Ghost World, Jeremy, but
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
yeah. Did you get that kind of feel from it? Just like that kind of youthful malaise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did. I think a little less. Yeah, like you said, a little
A
less
little less
quirky, a little
cynical,
darker. Yeah,
but
yeah.
that kind of feel to it.
And I think something because you mentioned that Linklater kind of rejected this idea of being a spokesman for his generation. I don't even think that this movie necessarily is speaking for a generation. I think it's the specificity of it that makes it applicable to the generation as a whole. I think that I get the sense that the goal was really just describing his own personal experience with his
Yeah.
friends and the feelings that they were having.
Mhm.
And then after it came out, after movies like this came out, after Nirvana hit the scene in a really big way, and that we realized that there's all these disenfranchised young people in the early 90s not really knowing where they're supposed to go, and they're, kind of upset about where things have landed for them, but not sure what to do about it, that people then started to say, oh, Richard Linklater has his finger on the pulse of
Yeah, like looking back, like,
culture.
oh, okay, yeah.
But at the time, I think that this is just kind of
He was
supposed
like, "This
to
is
be
my life. This
this is
like,
my life. Yeah.
these are the people I live amongst. This is my town. Like, that's
Mhm.
kind of what it was. And so, but it did inspire a lot of people. And like we talked about, the Sundance. When it showed at Sundance, it was a huge breakthrough for him and for indie film in general in the '90s, the early '90s, and many filmmakers were inspired by it. And not often when we do these series, Jeremy, do we we do films in order that actually correlate one from
After
one
the
to
other.
the other.
Yeah.
But the next movie we're going to talk about, not to get into it too much, but is Clerks, and Kevin Smith was greatly influenced by Clerks. He said this is his number one influence for when he made Clerks, and you can see it for sure being set all in one day, and the way the characters speak to each other,
Yeah.
and just that kind of scrappy,
The accessibility.
yeah, the accessibility, like things that you would
Yeah.
talk to your friends about, when you went to work and things like that. So
Yeah.
that's what this opened the door to.
Yeah, Slacker is never a movie that Hollywood, a studio, would crank out.
Right.
And I think that was the thing, is I think it's easy now for young filmmakers to feel like they can just go make a movie,
Mhm.
because the technology is there. Everyone has an iPhone or some kind of camera available. I don't want to say everyone has an iPhone, but pretty much everyone has
lot of
some
people.
kind of camera available in their life.
Yeah.
Even if it's something really, like, you can find cheap cameras online for like nothing these days.
Mhm.
So the idea of someone going out and just making a movie is so accessible now, even with Instagram. People are making movies. I bet in the course of a year, more people than not make a movie's worth of material in their Instagram stories alone.
Mhm.
Which is interesting. They're filming it. They're curating it. They're making movies in a weird way. They're just not feature films. But I think to think about the early or late 80s and early 90s, people had video cameras, but they weren't really thought of as a means of making serious movies.
Right, you couldn't get them into the local cinema with what you were shooting on for most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this idea of someone taking a 16 millimeter camera and making something about his hometown that wasn't Los Angeles, it wasn't New York,
Mhm.
it didn't have any stars in it,
Yeah, it
was a
unique.
really, it's a pretty radical idea. Jim Jarmusch had been doing his thing a little bit, and that kind of probably predated this and was an influence on Linklater. But I think that the way that this was done, where it kind of got rid of genre entirely, it really was just this slice of life
Mhm.
thing, but not in a way where it was saying, oh, we're edgy, we're a slice of life. It was literally just a day in the life with none of the exciting stuff. Nothing more exciting really happens, with the exception of maybe the car crash, than an average day.
Robbery, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Linklater's always been about the little moments. You can see that in
Mhm.
almost all of his films. He focuses on the little things. But we do talk about things that stuck out to us from the film, scenes or moments, whatever, characters. Was there anything like that for you that stuck out?
Yeah, I think that a couple things. One, so I don't know if there's a specific moment. One thing that always stuck with me, even since the first time I saw this movie, and I don't know why this stuck with me,
The
but
Madonna
there's...
pap smear, or
Oh, yeah, the Madonna... Well, so there's one scene where a young woman tries to sell what she claims to be Madonna's pap smear. Which, side note, early '90s independent movies between this and Reservoir Dogs just seem to have a thing about like ragging on Madonna.
Madonna was huge. I mean,
Madonna was huge, but they just seem that, I don't know if she, because she's the material girl, just like represented everything that these people kind of despise, so they would just but you know, she didn't do anything wrong. But so that moment was interesting. But this one moment that just kind of always stuck with me is there's this one scene somewhere in the middle where this guy just gets in his car and starts driving, and someone else comes up and asks for a ride, and then the third person comes up and asks for a ride, and just the three of them are cruising along in this really beautiful Austin, Texas sunlight, and nothing's really happened. You know, normally a car ride would be accompanied by like really, you know, and you think there's some music playing, but it's not like the music is in the forefront and it's like, oh, look how cool they are driving in the car, look how emotional it is. It's just kind of this moment where like they're just driving, music is playing, you know, that's it. There's not a lot more. They're having a very simple conversation, and something about that, like, it really stuck out to me. It almost makes me think of, Mark, I don't know if you had a chance to watch the third season of Twin Peaks, like the Return.
Oh, I did. It was amazing.
You did. So there's one bit in the Return, which I'll be totally upfront, I didn't love the Return.
Really?
There were certain
Jeremy,
things I loved.
Have to have another talk after this.
Like there were certain things that I loved, but there were also a lot of things. Yeah, I might have to go back. But there was one moment where I think it was God, I'm blanking on character names, but two characters in the Return were just having a discussion about the color of a couch that they wanted to buy, I believe, and this discussion just goes on for like 8 minutes, and it's just them talking about a couch, and it's so weird and uncomfortable because we're so as a culture, we're so film literate at this point and so used to having movies function in a certain way where unless that couch was going to somehow be totally essential to what was going to happen, they would not spend a second on it. And they spend almost, you know, almost a quarter of an episode, and then it never comes back. But I realized that what it does when you have something like that is it makes you as an audience member kind of lean in, because you're either going to check out entirely or you're going to just like lean in and be saying, why are they, like, what is going on? Why are they,
at that point, either you're with it or you're going to turn it off.
Yeah, and I feel like this whole movie, Slacker, has that kind of effect where because it opens in a way where he's talking about this dream the whole movie, you like from that opening scene, what makes it such a beautiful opening scene is it's so not dramatic that you're waiting for it to become dramatic. You're leaning in and you're saying, how is it gonna become something more? How is it gonna grow? And because you're forced to lean in like that, you actually are able to disconnect from narrative and just really listen to what the people are saying, really just let yourself be consumed by it, because so often I think that where movies actually lose people is trying to be too movie-like, if that makes sense.
Too narrative-driven, right?
Too narrative-driven, you know, too cinematic, too purposeful, and of course, you know,
too
the
perfect,
best
in a way.
Yeah, and and obviously there are filmmakers who do that well. You know, if you look at I
feel like Fincher is the first one that came to mind.
When you said that. Yeah, if you look at a David Fincher movie,
movie-like movies that are like very,
and they're amazing.
They pay attention to detail. Yeah, but he does it so well that it's
But he does it so well. But I think it's that weird in between part. But then you look at something like a movie, you know, Goodfellas or something like that, and that's very movie-like. There's a lot of significant details, but there's also a lot of shots of them just having dinner.
Hanging out. And those are like everyone's favorite scenes, you know?
Yeah, and so I think this is and Richard Linklater, which I would like to do, and we'll get to your favorite moments, Mark. But for me, so Richard Linklater is a really special filmmaker in my life, because before I even was into making films, when I was in high school, I played guitar, and that was like my main thing that I was focused on. And I came across Dazed and Confused one day, and the soundtrack, more than anything, just blew my mind. And from that moment on, Dazed and Confused was just like my favorite movie of all time. I went out and bought a DVD, and basically what I would do is when I was supposed to be doing homework, I would just watch Dazed and Confused over and over and over again. And I think the thing that ultimately got me with Dazed and Confused and most of Richard Linklater's movies that I've seen is the fact that there's a lot going on. You know, there is a lot going on, but it's those moments where it doesn't seem like a lot's happening, which is the majority of the movie in most of his films, that it's just so rich with detail. You know, it's just so alive.
In a way. It's refreshing that to not focus so much on plot or on a certain character. any of that, because you can get that in in almost any film,
Yeah,
really. So to see this, like you said, like at the time when it came out, it just blew people's minds, I'm sure.
yeah. And I think that a movie like Slacker, even though there's not really a plot, is kind of it is kind of rich in narrative in a weird way.
Hmm.
Because it's not like because we're just getting these little slices of these people's lives, but you're realizing kind of how just that one little thing that's happening, be it significant or insignificant, how by the next day they're going to be a slightly different person.
Yeah.
And to me, that seems so much more accurate towards the nature of change, of
Hmm.
human change, that change happens slowly over time. Um, and we don't even notice that we're changing when it happens. There's very rarely an aha moment, or if there is an aha moment, that aha moment has come after months of slowly working towards that aha moment, and we realize that that's that moment because we've been gradually moving towards that. And I think that
Hmm.
Richard Linklater really, really has a rich understanding of that and is able to portray it in a way that is engaging, which is
Yeah.
difficult.
And he's a very good filmmaker, and that helped. I mean, this movie shows the power of filmmaking.
Yeah.
Because, for example, take that scene that you discussed as one of the moments that you brought up when everyone's in the car driving down the road. If that was just in most other movies, it would be probably a bunch of cuts there, and maybe even a
Mhm.
montage with music
Or
over it,
just one shot, just
or
the car
just
driving through the frame.
yeah, or just a standard shot of a car. So the fact that he made this film the way he did and shot it the way he did, edited it the way he did, that's what makes Slacker what it is. More than anything, I think. And for my moment, I was gonna say just that ending is of passing the camera around between all the characters. I
Hmm.
thought that really it was just shooting from all their different perspectives. I mean, you couldn't have a more perfect ending for this movie in a
Yeah.
way. It's very impactful, in my opinion. When you walk away from the movie, I didn't remember a lot about this coming back to it because I hadn't seen it in a long time, but I did remember that ending,
Hmm.
especially him throwing the camera and that last shot. I mean, it's just kind of, yeah. I mean, no spoilers here because you really can't spoil this movie. But
No,
if
not a chance.
so, even explaining the ending, it doesn't until you've sat through the entire film and watched it. I don't think that ending could really have as much of an impact on you. You know what I mean? So yeah, great ending, great way to wrap it up, even though it wasn't really a narrative going on or anything
Yeah.
like that.
This is a movie that could have gone on forever. Like this movie,
Yeah.
they could have gotten in a car. Someone could have driven to the next state over. You go to a different town, and I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
kind of the beauty of it.
Uh
Is
huh.
it could because life doesn't just end.
Yeah.
People die, but
Hmm.
there are other people left behind, and
Other
the
people
camera's
go
going to
on
stay with
and.
those people, and new
Hmm.
stories happen.
Hmm.
And even if they're subtle, every person is going through their thing.
Yeah.
Every person is having their ideas, which seems like there are a lot of movies and books that kind of do that, but they're so on the nose where it's like,
Hmm.
oh, where everybody it has something going on, it's all interesting, but it's trying to say it really explicitly.
Hmm.
But to me, the specificity of this, the fact that it never draws attention to the fact that it's doing that, it's like the camera just kind of is on one person and then just
Yeah.
kind of moves to another, and it's like it's not saying like, oh, look at me, I'm making this big point. It's just kind of like,
It's just like
this is how it
this.
is to
This
me,
is where we are right now. This is
yeah.
where what we're looking at. And you really touched on what my final thoughts for this were going to be. So I'll go into that now. Actually, so my final thoughts were that this film really exemplifies that everyone is a character in their own way, which is kind of what you were just talking about, and that everyone's interesting and has their own story. Whether it's not a story that you like, they have a story. And even though we may never know them or only get to know them for a very brief time, there's more than meets the eye. So that's what I wanted to just kind of end on with my final thoughts. But what did you think to wrap this up, Jeremy?
My final thoughts would just be, really interesting film, really great for up and coming filmmakers to watch.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
definitely for sure.
because, like we said before, there's just an accessible style of filmmaking, especially today. It's like you grab a phone and you walk around taking video of your friends talking, and you write the conversations you're having, and even if it's not your big feature film, just as an exercise, it's definitely something that can be learned from. I think that Richard Linklater's entire filmography is worth watching for anyone.
Hmm.
They're really fun films to watch. um, yeah, no, great film. Like I said, Linklater is one of my favorite directors, and definitely worth checking out.
Yeah.
So that's all for today. Join us next time as we'll be jumping into the heart of the 90s independent cinema movement and going berserk with Kevin Smith's debut hit, Clerks.
Thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify. Also on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.